Hello and welcome to Let's Get Historical. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous quotes on women in history in our generation and why I personally dislike it. So, for those of you who love history, you've probably heard this quote before. The quote that I'm talking about is, quote, well-behaved women seldom make history, end quote. So I personally believe that this quote is incredibly sexist, and I've actually done some more research on it for this episode. And so I'm going to be sharing some surprising facts about how this quote came about and how it was originally used and things like that. So we're going to get into it, but I first want to just have a little disclaimer. This is my personal opinion. You are entitled to love this quote all you want, but I just personally cannot stand this quote. So anyway, uh, the reason that I just really don't like this quote is because the way that it's used in our modern day is essentially that we're interpreting the quote to mean that women have to do something completely, out of the ordinary, completely outrageous, kind of. They have to be, it has to be scandalous. It has to be, so loud and in your face and that it can't be ignored. That's kind of how this is being interpreted. And the reason why I personally believe this is happening is because, as I've said before, and as I will say many times again, history is a very male-dominated subject. It is just like STEM. Most of the history books have been written by men. History has been passed down mainly through men passing down history, men recording history, etc. And so, therefore, this quote, put another way, is essentially saying that men are only interested in women behaving badly because they only include women who have done something totally scandalous or, out of the ordinary or just completely, unheard of in their society at the time. And those are the only women that ever get included in history books. So this is, first of all, I just want to say, this is an interpretation of the term well-behaved that is being defined by men. Okay, so who's deciding what well-behaved means? In this instance, it's men. Okay, and whose standards are we adhering to? Men's. Okay, so that is essentially my barometer for whether this quote is sexist or not. So I personally believe the way that we are using this quote today is a very sexist interpretation of this quote. We are essentially saying that women cannot possibly do anything that is worthy of being written about for generations to come unless it is seen by men as scandalous or completely, off the rails or whatever that may be. Like you basically have to be a queen or in her own right or something like that in order to move history forward. And that is just absolutely not true. There are so many women who have done so many amazing things that don't necessarily get the credit or the recognition that they deserve simply because men have either been misogynistic in recording history, or they've just simply only been interested in what the men are doing, and they just don't even look at the plethora of evidence that we have all around us for what women were doing and how women were contributing. So that is why I personally think this quote is sexist. And I remember when I was volunteering on college campuses a few years ago, I would actually see quite a few women have this quote like on their binders, or some would have it on t-shirts and things like that. And it just frustrated me so much because I was like, oh my God, no. um, so I know that this may be an unpopular opinion, because if you are one of those people who had this quote on your laptop or on your binder or on a t-shirt, then you may disagree with me, and that is totally fine because we are all allowed to interpret this quote as we see fit. However, I have I have discovered that the author of this quote, the woman who actually coined this phrase, agrees with me. And she believes that her quote was taken out of context, and she actually tried to speak out against it in the beginning, but it just sort of spiraled out of her control, and so ultimately she felt like she had to go with it. So we are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about who she is, who is the woman who actually coined this quote. Okay, well, her name is Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. All right, so this quote was she first included this quote in a 1976 scholarly article on Puritan funeral services. So, for those of you who may not be aware, in the early American colonial period, particularly if you know the story of the Mayflower, the initial settlers were Puritans. They were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and that's why they were coming to the New World and creating their essentially puritanical communities. So, for instance, for those of you who may have heard of the Salem witch trials, the people living in Salem at the time were Puritans. This phrase was taken completely out of context, right? She was talking specifically about Puritan funeral services. She was talking about the role that women played in Puritan funeral services, and essentially how male historians have overlooked the women in Puritan funeral services, or something to that effect. And so essentially, she had a very specific, kind of context as to what she was talking about, and the standards that she was actually speaking about were specifically Puritan standards, right? So she was, who was deciding what is well behaved at this in this particular instance. She was talking about Puritans and sort of gender roles in Puritan colonial America. So the quote went viral in the years after this scholarly article first appeared, and it's since been put on merchandise of all kinds and took on a life of its own. Dr. Ulrich has been quoted as, talking about how the quote was taken out of context, how she understands that when it's not kind of put in its specific in its specific place, it can actually seem very sexist, because you are essentially saying that women have to adhere to male standards of what is well behaved, and that is just simply not a good solid standard to judge women on. And so just because that was essentially what she was saying was being done in the area of puritanical studies, or Puritan history studies, or whatever it's called. It was not necessarily meant to be this sort of universal statement on women in history, as it's sort of become. So, Dr. Ulrich actually wrote a book called "Well-Behaved Women," sort of playing off this quote that she did coin, and she cited the lives of women who made history, who were more quote unquote well-behaved. And haven't really made it into as many history books. She does include Christine de Pizan, who we're going to be learning about in a future episode. And so there are just so many women that we can see throughout history who have done amazing, wonderful things, and we're going to be learning about some of them in this series. So Dr. Ulrich also won a prize, a Pulitzer Prize, excuse me, for A Midwife's Tale, which is a history book essentially analyzing the diaries of early American midwives in New England. It was also made into a movie. I believe you can get it on Amazon, if it's still there. But essentially it talks about, like early American midwives, and how that all went. So talking more about women who were quote unquote well behaved in the past, right? They were helping out with birth and everything in the in colonial New England. A little bit more about Laurel Thatcher Ulrich before we close this episode. So she has taught at the University of New Hampshire as well as Harvard University, where she currently serves as a professor emerita. And she is also on the list of the most influential Mormon feminists. She has written works on women's roles in Mormon history, and she's also been incredibly involved in in various Mormon groups on Harvard's campus and in the broader community. So, and considering that this quote has just gone completely viral and is just everywhere, I think that she really does deserve more credit, and she deserves to be known as the woman behind the quote. So I hope that you enjoyed this insight. I hope you can see now why I believe that the quote, well behaved women seldom make history, is rather sexist and centers men and centers male attitudes. And in particular, it centers a very narrow view of men's attitudes toward women, which just don't hold true in most settings. So I do want to say it's very stereotypical. It's not necessarily um, you know, kind of true to every moment in history. It's very specific to a certain point in our culture and in society. So I just want to make that very clear before wrapping up the episode. Okay, I think that is all I have to say on that, and I will catch you in the next episode.